Welcome. My name is Shannon Bryant, and I am the Virtual Blended Learning Coordinator here in Keller ISD. And this session is entitled A Tale of Two Teachers. We're going to look at the journey of two different teachers, and it is not that one way is better than the other. In fact, I even struggled with making both of the teachers the same identical person, because sometimes you live on one side of the road and sometimes you live on the other side of the road. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's first look at two different approaches to teaching. These could be approaches that you learned in college, or they were approaches that was how you did school, or maybe even things that you've learned on your team. My personal experience was a little bit of both. I learned a lot more about brain development and thinking the way that you see on the right, but when I got into the field, I was so afraid of being able to manage it that I moved more to the left, and that's okay. So let's look at these two roads. The approach on the left is to build your resources. And then once you have that year all together, learning how to teach and learning how your subject during that first year, and then you should have something that is somewhat perfected that you are tweaking year after year. So you would take that package of materials that you put together and the ways you have learned to teach with those materials and just practice that same thing year after year. And then once you felt that you had mastered that, you would then teach other people in your department how to use those same resources and teach that way. And it sounds like a very efficient way to do things. New TEKS, new resources, new assignments, change. And maybe it's that you're teaching a whole different grade level or course the next year, or you had to move and they don't have a position open in an area or grade level that you are comfortable with, and you have to move to another one. So your assignment can change because of that. We also know that about every 5 years in Texas, our standards are going to change, and our resources that go with those standards are also going to change. That's not a bad thing. I know it feels like something is being done to us, but let's remember the change that is also going on in the world. In history, more history was just made. If I blink, more history was just made. More history was just made. So within a 5-year period of time, there are more things that we have added to our history, more literature that we've added, so it makes sense that we would update our materials for social studies and ELAR. You also have that happening with math and science. There are, in fact, probably more. There is new research that's coming out. There is new information that is coming out. There are more ideas that are out there. And we want our curriculum to reflect what is most up to date. Plus, this means you are really doing your job, because who's out there making these advances in research? Who is out there discovering these things? Your students. So if we've really done our job, this change every 5 years is something we should embrace, because that is the goal, to have our students out there in the world impacting, change, growing, making things better every day, right? So change is a roadblock if we use that method that appears to be very efficient, because we're having to go through that cycle again every time that there's change. Let's look over at the other teacher. This other teacher believes that her job is to teach the students to think. It's not about a content. It's not about a course. It's about focused on teaching kids how to think. So since that is her focus, it's going to drive her priorities, her processes, her systems, everything that's in place in her classroom. Or him. So sorry. Also, this is a big one, she is comfortable with using similar best practices in all grades and subjects. Here's why that's important. When we look at elementary teachers are really apt at doing this because they probably teach all or most subjects that their students are doing. So if they can take their strategies in one subject and use that same strategy in another subject, it's easy for the kid because they don't have to stop and relearn the strategy. Consequently, that is true at older grades. If I, a math teacher, can look and use a strategy from elementary or even one that's used in science and make it applicable for my content, then my kids are seeing something that they may be familiar with, maybe in a subject that they're more comfortable with or been more successful at. If I work at that, it can make it to where my changes that could pop up are things that fuel me and keep me going. She also knows that she has to continue to learn and apply new research. And we just said why that's so important, because there will be new research all the time. If we have that mindset and think about it that way, it sounds as if we're having to do more work, but we're actually being less frustrated because the change that we're experiencing is something that fuels all of those goals. That change helps us to make that connection between best practices and grade level. And that change also gives us more tools to help kids think instead of just learning specific skills. So one of those is fueled by change, and one of those creates stress and a roadblock when the change is entered. What happens though is that teachers in either road move back and forth because you're not all one way or the other way. You may find yourself moving back and forth depending upon your circumstance. I'll give you some ideas here. For example, let's say you've had a family tragedy and it is really consuming a lot of your time and thought process. You may have to revert to teaching differently for that year just so that your kids aren't left behind in the midst of you dealing with whatever your issue is that you're working on. It's not somewhere that I would live, but if that is what has happened, you might need to move on over here to this side and to use some of your peers' materials that have been teaching this way. I go back to my first year teaching middle school. I did not have tools and resources already built. So it was like I was starting out over on this side of the road, even though I knew in my heart the other side was better. So as I was using these resources, I tried to think and apply them this other way. For example, I'll give you a really good example on this. In my math team, we would bring all our materials and we would talk about the different ways we were going to use this. It was usually just banks of problems from our favorite resource. But our discussion about how we would use those problems in our class brought out the strategies that we were going to use. And that helped me focus on the strategy of teaching students how to think about any topic that I gave them. And then I could tweak these different strategies even if I experienced any type of change. Let that wash over you. Oftentimes, we move from this side to this side because we believe that this road over here is going to cause us to have to do more work. It's the strategy that you focus on and apply it in any different setting. When you can learn how to do that, the change won't cause you so much frustration. So it's all in the way that you are looking at the work that you're doing, because I guarantee you, everybody spends about the same amount of work in any job that they have. I've learned this for myself. When I was in the classroom, I had a to-do list. And no matter what other job that I've held, this was about the same length of my to-do list. You have your to-do list. I spoke with a teacher the other day and she said, I'm working till midnight every night. And I stopped her right there and I said, please know that not everybody on your team is working till midnight every night. We have to find a way to make that list a list that is manageable. And if it is you that is causing yourself to stay up and work too long, then you need to get with somebody and say, how can I think differently and apply just a few strategies everywhere, instead of feeling like every single concept I teach has to come up with a whole new way of teaching it. We're about to look at some very interesting data in just a minute. But before we do, what moves us across this bridge back and forth? It's the peers that we talk to in our planning meetings, and whether that conversation leads us to try new things or leads us to say, I'm done, I just can't do anymore. Depending upon where you are at and what your team is talking about, that has the biggest influence on you. Now, nobody wants to come straight out of college and be that person that's acting like they know it all when they've only had 10 minutes in the classroom, and I don't advise you to be that person. But I do advise you to listen, take what your peers are doing, and try those strategies that you learn that help students to think. And then go back to your peers and say what's working well for you. If it appears that that's ruffling their feathers, it's okay. You just go in your room and keep doing you. As long as you're getting good results from your students, that's what's going to matter. And then people will want to know, what are you doing that's different? Very important. Think about that. Notice that there are exit ramps. So yeah, sometimes we're just, in our mind, burnt out. The burnout does not come from the to-do list. You totally control that. The burnout comes from the workload we have created on how we've interpreted these things. It comes from a lost joy where we're not getting happy about the stuff that we're doing anymore, or not having that community and connection. And it could be a combination of all three. Here is where I'm getting that information, because this didn't just come out of the brain of Shannon Bryant Says. There is actually research that show us teachers burn out most about every 5 years. So we know that in 5 years, the majority of teachers are going to hit some type of burnout. Now let's look at something else, because this magic number 5 is important. Up here, if we take this approach to build our resources, perfect using those resources, and then teach others how to do it, if we take that approach, I want to show you some more research. This is a really great book about the 10,000 hour rule, and it takes that long to master something. Guys, in teaching years, that's about 5 years. So let's put all this together. It takes me 5 years to master something, and every 5 years the standards are going to change. In about 5 years, the majority of teachers will hit burnout. It all goes back to the 10,000 rule. Because if it takes me 5 years to master something, then it's not the fact that now I know how to teach and it's too much, I'm burnt out. It's the fact that I can't deal with the change that is predicted to come about every 5 years. If the way we teach is fueled by change, then those 5 years would only propel us on to do better instead of worse. It's kind of interesting how all that works together, huh? The 5-year deal. I know, I'm not even that smart. I just found it. Now, I do want to point something out. Let's say you got on either one of those roads and you made it to the very end of your teaching career. Stayed in education the majority of the time. Those teachers that in those roads still have the same amount of successes and the same amount of failures. It's not that one performs better than the other. But what we do know is that teachers who continue to learn and grow and stay, that one thing, learning and growing, tends to keep them in the profession longer because it brings about joy. They are learning They are changing, so they're adapting with the change that is happening to them because they're continuing to grow also. So when your district, when your principal, when your lead sends you to PD, they're sending you to PD not to fix you. They're sending you because they want to keep you. They want you to grow in what you're learning and therefore have joy about the change that's coming. It's a very different way to look at things, but I bet if you started asking your peers in the field of education what was their belief about how they should teach Plan A or Plan B up here, you're probably going to see that the majority of teachers resonate on one side of the road or the other, or a combination of both. And that's fine, as long as you understand how that is going to impact your ability to cope with change, because the outcome is to keep you on the road for a longer period of time because our students need you. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Have a great day.